You think your bedroom gets cold? Try sleeping on a pile of straw next to a pig, in a hut with no glass windows, no central heating, and frost creeping across the walls. For medieval peasants, freezing to death in your sleep wasn't just a nightmare, it was a nightly threat. But here's the twist. They didn't just survive, they adapted with shocking, ingenious strategies we've totally forgotten. From sleeping with livestock to making medieval sleeping bags, this isn't the cozy Middle Ages you imagined. One mistake, and you didn't wake up. So how did they pull it off? Imagine trying to fall asleep in your house tonight. No heater, no blankets, no insulated walls, not even glass on your windows. Just a drafty wooden hut, an open fire if you're lucky, and temperatures dipping well below freezing. Sounds like a recipe for hypothermia, right? Yet medieval peasants somehow survived night after frigid night, winter after brutal winter. Contrary to the modern image of peasants shivering to death in their sleep, they weren't clueless or helpless. These folks didn't just accept frostbite as a fact of life. They innovated. In fact, what they lacked in modern tech, they made up for with gritty pragmatism, clever architecture, layered clothing, and a communal sense of survival that might actually shame our modern obsession with personal space and thermostat wars. Let's start with the homes themselves. The standard peasant dwelling in 12th to 14th century Europe was a timber-framed structure packed with wattle and daub. These homes didn't come with central heating, but they did have a built-in advantage: low ceilings and small interiors. Less space meant less area to warm up, and the roof, often thatched, a surprisingly good insulator when well maintained. It's not unlike living in a very rustic, slightly flammable thermos. The biggest twist: most of these homes were one-room affairs shared with livestock. Yes, the family cow, sheep, maybe even a pig or two might be bunking just a few feet from where you laid your head. But before you cringe at the thought of a snoring ox next to your straw mattress, consider this. Animal body heat can raise the ambient temperature in a small space by several degrees. It's basically medieval radiant heating, courtesy of Bessie the cow. Even during peak winter, peasants rarely slept completely alone. Entire families piled into shared beds or slept shoulder to shoulder on straw mats. This wasn't just about bonding, it was thermodynamics. Sleeping alone in sub-zero conditions meant faster heat loss. Cuddling, that was survival. Medieval families perfected the art of the human furnace, using collective body heat to stay alive when the temperature dropped. Still, the real magic wasn't in the room, it was in what they wore. Layering wasn't a fashion choice, it was a nightly ritual. Linen undergarments, wool tunics, heavy cloaks, all kept on during sleep. In colder months, they didn't change into pajamas. They slept in what they wore during the day, sometimes adding extra layers or even climbing under rough woolen blankets if they were lucky enough to own one. Linen, believe it or not, was the unsung hero, breathable, easy to clean, and surprisingly warm when used in multiple layers. Medieval straw mattresses, meanwhile, weren't plush, but they were functional. Packed with hay or dried reeds, they offered both insulation from the cold ground and a bit of comfort. Underneath, peasants often laid wooden planks or woven mats to keep direct cold and dampness at bay. Compared to today's memory foam, it sounds miserable, but back then, it was the difference between a tolerable night and a frostbitten morning. Now here's where things get even more ingenious. Some regions, particularly in northern and central Europe, used a bed structure known as a box bed or alcove bed. Enclosed on three sides with wood and sometimes even a curtain across the front, these beds trapped heat like a cocoon. In Scotland and parts of France, entire families would crawl into these tiny wooden enclosures, practically forming a human thermal battery. They looked like closets, but they were heat retention marvels. Compare that to today's open-plan bedrooms and minimalistic mattress-on-the-floor setups, and suddenly the idea of sleeping in a wooden cupboard doesn't seem so bad. In fact, it's arguably more effective than some modern minimalist fads when it comes to beating the cold. Let's not forget fire. Open hearths were central to peasant homes, often never fully extinguished in winter months. Though dangerous and smoky, these fires served multiple purposes: cooking, light, and just enough radiant heat to take the edge off the chill. The hearth was sacred, not for romance, but for survival. Ashes were often banked at night to retain embers for the next morning, and beds were positioned as close as safely possible to soak up residual warmth. But open flames came with serious risks. In regions with more firewood scarcity, like parts of England, peasants relied more on insulation and less on flames. In the Germanic and Scandinavian zones, by contrast, hearths stayed active longer, and homes often had stone bases that retained heat better. Geography, resource access, and even forest laws, which controlled who could gather firewood, played major roles in how cozy your medieval nights were. One overlooked trick. Hot bricks or stones. Peasants heated rocks in the fire, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them in beds or under blankets. Basically, the 14th century version of an electric heating pad. And if stones weren't handy, they'd warm dried grain sacks or even coals in clay pots. Primitive, sure, but effective. Here's something wild. Some peasants even slept with their tools. A sickle under the pillow wasn't just protection. It also meant keeping your iron from rusting in cold, damp air. And the added metal by your body created localized heat zones. Not exactly cozy, but again, they weren't prioritizing comfort. They were prioritizing not dying. And speaking of dying, it's easy to assume that people froze in their beds regularly. In reality, cold-related death during sleep was rare among settled peasants. Far more common were respiratory illnesses from smoke inhalation or damp conditions, or accidents involving unattended fires. The fear wasn't freezing solid, it was waking up coughing blood. By contrast, today's cold complaints, like turning up the thermostat because it's 18 degrees Celsius, would seem absurd to medieval villagers who went months barely seeing double digits. Their toughness wasn't just cultural, it was conditioned. From birth, they were trained to endure. Babies were swaddled tightly not just for warmth but to toughen them up. Children learned early how to curl into a ball for maximum body heat retention. So next time you throw on a fleece blanket or complain about poor insulation, remember, a medieval peasant survived worse, sometimes by spooning a goat, sometimes by sleeping in a box, but always through pure human adaptability. And this was just how they slept. Wait till we see how they lived by day. If sharing your bed with livestock and entire families wasn't challenging enough, things got even harder when you remember this. Medieval winters weren't like today's chilly discomforts, they were deadly. From roughly 1300 onward, Europe entered what's known as the Little Ice Age, a period of colder, wetter, longer winters. Snowfall increased, harvests failed more often, and nights got so cold that ink froze in monastery scriptoria. Sleeping warm was no longer just about comfort, it was about survival. This colder climate forced peasants to double down on their warming strategies. But unlike today, they couldn't just buy thermal blankets or install insulation. Their solutions had to be DIY, drawn from centuries-old traditions and adapted to whatever their specific region allowed. This is where geography, social class, and even religion collided in the bedroom, sometimes literally. Let's start with the poorest of the poor. These weren't the peasants with cottages and livestock. These were landless laborers, often homeless in winter, who relied on church charity, traveling work, or crowded inns. Many of them slept in barns, stables, or communal shelters, curled under piles of hay like animals. There's a record from 14th century Yorkshire describing how beggars would burrow into straw piles in monastery barns, sometimes suffocating overnight from lack of airflow. You wanted warmth, but not too much. A hot, airless space was as deadly as an icy one. Now contrast that with better-off peasants who had access to multi-room cottages. They could afford to designate a sleeping space, often furthest from the door and hearth to avoid smoke and drafts. These families sometimes even built elevated wooden sleeping platforms, like medieval bunk beds, to stay away from cold stone or dirt floors. In wealthier regions of Germany and Flanders, some peasants lined their walls with tapestries or hung woolen cloth to reduce drafts, an early version of thermal wallpaper. But even the best planning couldn't eliminate cold. That's where routines came in. Medieval bedtime wasn't random, it was choreographed. The fire had to be banked properly, embers covered with ash to smolder safely till morning. Clothes were dried, if possible, near the hearth, and water jugs were stored upside down to keep them from freezing solid. Families often ate their last meal huddled by the fire, not just for warmth but to fill their bellies with calories, an internal furnace for the long, cold night. Calories mattered more than you'd think. Cold bodies need fuel, and medieval peasants didn't have much fat to spare. So they relied on warm porridges, fatty broths, and beer to heat up from the inside out. In some regions, villagers drank posset, a hot milk drink spiked with ale or wine, before bed. Think of it as a medieval hot toddy, warming, mildly intoxicating, and probably the best part of the day. Even social behavior revolved around managing the cold. Weddings were timed for late autumn so newlyweds could share a bed through the worst of winter. Neighbors sometimes invited each other to sleep over, not out of kindness, but for body heat. And servants often slept at the foot of their master's bed, not just for status, but for shared warmth. In one Swiss account, a household of 9 people, parents, children, 2 maids, a pig, and a goat, shared one curtained bed. It's almost comical, until you realize that every extra body made the difference between warmth and pneumonia. And then there was the matter of night clothes, or lack thereof. We imagine nightshirts, thanks to Victorian fashion, but in the Middle Ages, sleepwear wasn't a thing for the poor. Most peasants slept in what they worked in, maybe adding a second wool tunic if they were lucky. Undressing was a luxury for those with warm rooms and clean linen. For everyone else, stripping down at night was asking for frostbite. Yet there were moments of comfort too. Herbal remedies like lavender or chamomile were added to bed straw to mask odors and promote rest. In colder regions, people rubbed themselves with goose fat or lard before bed to trap body heat under clothing. Primitive, yes, but surprisingly effective. Even urine was sometimes used, heated and poured into clay pots to function like a hot water bottle. Gross. Definitely. But in survival mode, nothing was off the table. All this effort, just to make it through the night. Yet what's fascinating is how normalized it became. Sleeping in the cold wasn't considered hardship, it was life. People adapted not just physically but mentally. Chronic shivering, stiff joints, and blue lips were just signs of the season, not medical emergencies. If anything, too much warmth was seen as suspicious, indulgent, even sinful. Monks in many orders were forbidden from using bedclothes, partly to encourage spiritual toughness. Mortification of the flesh, they called it. Freezing for God. Compare that with our modern sleep culture: memory foam mattresses, heated blankets, blackout curtains, melatonin gummies. We treat sleep like a sacred ritual of comfort. Medieval folks, they treated it like a tactical operation. Minimum exposure, maximum survival. And just when you think you've grasped the limits of their endurance, consider this: winter wasn't even their worst sleeping season. That title goes to late spring, when rain and melting snow turned homes into moldy, damp, insect-ridden hovels. Cold you could fight. Dampness, that was the real enemy. So how did they survive year after year, night after night? Through an ever-deepening conflict between climate, class, and sheer human willpower. And we're only beginning to scratch the frostbitten surface. By now, it's clear that sleeping in medieval Europe wasn't a dreamy, peaceful affair. It was a nightly battle against the cold, the damp, and sometimes even death. But just when you think the story couldn't escalate further, it does. Because even the best peasant survival hacks weren't always enough. As winters grew harsher during the 14th and 15th centuries, new pressures emerged that made sleep even more precarious, and often political. Here's the twist: climate wasn't the only force freezing people out of their beds. Economics and social structures piled on. The feudal system, already grinding down peasants with endless labor and taxes, started to strain under environmental pressure. Failed harvests meant less food. Less food meant weaker bodies. Weaker bodies meant worse cold tolerance. And in a world where sleep was already an act of defense, malnourishment turned it into a gamble. In parts of France and England, reports from the mid-1300s describe people sleeping in shifts, not because of space, but to conserve heat. Families rotated who slept near the fire, who stayed awake to tend the embers, and who curled up with the livestock. Sleep became strategic. You didn't just lay down, you took turns battling the elements. What's more, the Black Death, yes, that one, played a strange role in sleep culture. After wiping out up to half the population, it left villages half empty. In some places, there were suddenly more beds than people. But fewer people meant fewer warm bodies to share those beds. So ironically, survivors of the plague sometimes found themselves colder at night, not warmer. Meanwhile, religious beliefs continued to shape nighttime behavior in extreme ways. In particularly devout communities, people fasted during Advent and Lent, not just from food, but from warmth. Some even chose to sleep without blankets during holy periods as a form of penance. In colder regions, this bordered on madness. But suffering was spiritual currency, and warmth was considered a temptation of the flesh. Even the church's architecture didn't help. Monks and nuns often lived in stone cloisters, beautiful, echoing, and cold as death. Many abbeys forbade fires in sleeping quarters, even in January. Benedictine monks were known to sleep fully clothed, on wooden slats, under thin wool cloaks. It wasn't just a test of devotion. It was a constant flirtation with hypothermia. Yet perhaps the most dramatic shift came from conflict. War doesn't stop for winter, and neither did medieval armies. When villages were raided, or worse, conscripted, entire families lost their homes, livestock, or both. No home meant no hearth. Refugees from these burned-out villages often sought shelter in churches or forests, sleeping in whatever protection they could find. Bark huts, cloaks strung over branches, even dug-out earth hollows were used as makeshift sleeping dens. And remember, medieval beds weren't just furniture. They were family property, passed down as heirlooms, listed in wills. Losing a bed could mean social humiliation. Owning one, even a basic straw mattress, was a mark of stability. During wartime, stealing someone's bed wasn't just theft, it was symbolic. You weren't just robbing them of comfort. You were ripping away their identity. Of course, peasants weren't passive victims in all this. They adapted again. Portable bedding became common in some regions, rolled wool mats, travel cloaks, and even sleep sacks made of stitched sheepskin. Think medieval sleeping bags, dragged from barn to barn, hill to hill. Some wealthy peasants even had traveling beds with collapsible wooden frames, used when fleeing conflict or migrating for seasonal labor. Then came the communal sleeping halls. As rural poverty swelled and vagabond populations grew, some towns opened large indoor spaces, often former guild halls or unused churches, as emergency winter shelters. These were overcrowded, noisy, and lacked privacy, but they offered one essential thing: shared body heat. A town crier might announce at dusk when doors opened. People packed in like sardines, lying head to foot in rows, sometimes using shoes as pillows. It was chaotic, but survivable. Meanwhile, innovations trickled in. In parts of Bohemia and the Low Countries, wealthier farmers began using glazed ceramic bed warmers. Hollow, oven-heated discs slipped under blankets before bedtime. Some were simple terracotta bowls. Others were ornate status symbols. These devices didn't revolutionize warmth, but they helped. And more importantly, they reflected a crucial truth: comfort was becoming a class privilege. Let's not romanticize this. These weren't cozy, picturesque nights by the hearth. This was survival by inches. People froze to death in roadside ditches. Children were born on straw piles in barns and didn't live past sunrise. A single mistake, letting a fire go out, sleeping wet, misjudging wind direction, could end a life. But amidst all this misery, something else emerged: community resilience. Villagers shared firewood, patched each other's roofs, invited the elderly into their homes on cold nights. Hospitality wasn't just kindness, it was protection. Some regions even had sleeping guilds, informal groups that rotated care for the weakest, especially in alpine communities. The motto was simple: if one of us freezes, we all might. And here's the wildest thing: for many peasants, winter nights weren't a single block of sleep. They followed a two-sleep pattern, going to bed after sundown, waking after a few hours, then sleeping again before dawn. That wakeful middle phase was used to stoke the fire, check the animals, or even pray. This segmented sleep wasn't a sign of insomnia. It was biology responding to cold and darkness, and it actually helped regulate body heat better than a full 8-hour snooze. So while modern sleep science is just discovering polyphasic patterns and circadian rhythms, medieval peasants were living them, by necessity, not design. And in that strange rhythm, between exhaustion and survival, they carved out something extraordinary: a way to rest in a world that didn't want them to. By the 15th century, the toll of generations sleeping in the cold was more than just physical. It had psychological consequences, cultural ripples, and even legal ramifications. Medieval life wasn't just shaped by hardship. It was defined by how people coped with it night after night. And nowhere was that more obvious than in the rituals, superstitions, and laws that grew around the peasant bed. Let's talk fear. The night wasn't just cold, it was dangerous. Darkness concealed thieves, wolves, ghosts, and disease. People feared sudden death in their sleep, especially during the coldest months. Folklore from England to Bohemia teemed with tales of night hags, demons that suffocated sleeping victims. Today we'd call it sleep paralysis, but then, it was proof that your soul could freeze while your body burned with fever. The cure? Sleep with iron under your pillow, garlic at the windowsill, and a prayer whispered into your straw. These fears weren't irrational. Cold stress weakened immune systems. Entire villages could be wiped out not by plague, but by winter-borne pneumonia. Parish records from 1480s Burgundy describe waves of winter deaths after prolonged freeze events. In response, communities built rituals around sleep, crossing oneself before bed, hanging herbs like rosemary or juniper near the mattress, and even sleeping with holy relics sewn into tunics. For children and the elderly, things were worse. Infants were especially vulnerable. Cribs were rare, and babies often slept beside parents, swaddled tight to avoid exposure. But too tight, and they suffocated. Too loose, and they froze. The margin of error was heartbreakingly slim. In a Flemish town near Ghent, a priest recorded 10 infant deaths one January, all from the night chill. And while men might tough it out near the hearth or out in the barn, women often bore the worst of the consequences. Mothers woke through the night to check on children, tend fires, and manage nocturnal chores. It was exhausting, dangerous work, and it went unrecognized. Sleep deprivation among medieval peasant women was real and brutal. Letters from 15th century France mention wives who had not closed an eye since the new moon. Despite all this, the peasant bedroom, or more often, sleeping corner, was a deeply symbolic place. It was where people were born, where they died, where they married, and yes, where they froze. And because of that, sleeping rights became legal issues. Customary law in many regions recognized a family's right to a certain amount of bed space, especially for widows or orphans. Land disputes could include arguments over who got to sleep near the only warm wall. Seriously, things got so intense that some manorial lords issued bed quotas, rules about how many people could legally sleep in a single room or structure. On one estate in Normandy, there's a record from 1472 limiting peasant households to 6 per sleeping hut, citing insufficient hearths and airflow. Overcrowding wasn't just a fire risk, it was a political one. And through all this, the peasant ingenuity never stopped. Some began building heat traps, low stone benches beside the hearth where people could sleep curled up like cats. In colder months, these spaces were passed down like heirlooms. Getting that corner spot could be a family's secret to survival. Others dug shallow depressions in dirt floors, lined with straw and cloth, creating windless pockets of warmth. Primitive, yes, but effective. Clothing evolved too. Layered wool became thicker. Tunics were sometimes lined with fur, rabbit, squirrel, even rat if needed. Hoods became nightcaps, and sleeves doubled as mittens. People sewed inner pockets into garments where they'd store warm stones or even embers in clay pouches. A walking fire hazard? Sure. But warmth was worth the risk. Still, no amount of ingenuity could eliminate the emotional cost. Night brought isolation, fear, and exhaustion. And perhaps the most telling cultural shift came in the form of lullabies and oral tradition. Songs sung at bedtime weren't just for comfort, they were survival instructions. Lines like, "Lie still or the cold will take you," weren't metaphor. They were warnings. Folktales grew darker too. In Germanic regions, winter spirits like Perkta were said to slit open the bellies of children who slept too long or too warm. In Slavic folklore, domovoi, house spirits, would leave a sleeping family if they failed to keep the hearth lit. And in England, there were tales of Bedless John, a wandering spirit doomed to haunt doorsteps, shivering, because no one ever gave him a place to sleep. These weren't just spooky bedtime stories. They were communal reminders of what was at stake. To sleep safely was to obey not just the rules of physics, but of morality, superstition, and solidarity. You stayed warm not just by fire, but by family, faith, and folklore. In time, as Europe crept toward the Renaissance, sleeping customs began to shift again. Chimneys appeared in more peasant homes, dramatically improving airflow and heat retention. Beds raised off the ground became more common. Straw was replaced with wool stuffing or down feathers for the lucky. And slowly, the idea of sleeping comfortably, rather than just not dying, took hold. But that was a long, slow change. For centuries, sleep remained the battlefield of the poor, a nightly test of strategy, strength, and sometimes sheer luck. And the scars of those cold nights didn't fade easily. After centuries of enduring brutal winters with little more than hay, wool, and stubbornness, something began to shift in medieval sleep culture. Not overnight, and not for everyone, but enough to suggest a subtle evolution. The late 15th and early 16th centuries saw the first real cracks in the tradition of suffering through the night. And as sleeping habits began to change, so did medieval society itself. For starters, peasants started demanding more. Literally. In some parts of rural England, village records show laborers requesting sleeping quarters as part of their compensation, alongside wages or food. Beds were no longer optional or private, they were entitlements. A warm place to sleep had become not a luxury, but a mark of dignity. This wasn't a revolution, but it was a quiet rebellion against the notion that peasants should simply endure. At the same time, communal bonds grew stronger. The medieval concept of neighbor expanded, especially in harsh environments. Sleeping arrangements became shared affairs, not just within families but between unrelated households. In parts of Scandinavia and the Alps, whole villages rotated firewood collection and nighttime sheltering. If one household ran out of fuel, another stepped in. It was mutual aid, centuries before the term existed. Even monasteries slowly relaxed. In warmer regions, monastic orders began allowing bedclothes, thin wool blankets, then sheets. These small concessions marked a softening in the belief that cold strengthened the soul. Human needs were, finally, being acknowledged as divine. And then came the architecture. Chimneys spread across rural Europe like wildfire, figuratively and literally. With them came better ventilation, less smoke, and more efficient heating. Homes expanded, with dedicated sleeping lofts, enclosed hearths, and even separate rooms for children or guests. For the first time, sleep became somewhat private and warmer. Furnishings improved too. Wooden bed frames became common even among modest households. Mattresses were stuffed not just with straw but feathers, moss, or wool. The more ambitious even created bedding systems with layered quilts, sheep hides, and down sacks. People who once slept in corners now slept in constructed, chosen spaces. That shift, from passive survival to active comfort, was seismic. But perhaps the biggest change was psychological. Sleep was no longer just escape or endurance. It was becoming rest. People began to expect sleep, plan for it, even shape their daily rhythms around it. Agricultural calendars began to factor in rest periods in winter, not just because fields were frozen, but because bodies needed restoration. Parish sermons mentioned the sin of overwork and the virtue of sleep. And as Europe moved toward modernity, these ideas carried forward. The peasant bed, once a cold pile of straw under a leaking roof, transformed into a symbol of human persistence. Sleeping through the cold wasn't just a biological need. It was a cultural triumph. In many ways, that legacy still lives in us. Our beds, thermostats, and routines are luxury level compared to the medieval norm. Yet the instinct to huddle, to gather warmth, to treat rest as a communal, sacred, and strategic act, it's ancient. And it's still wired deep in us. We're not so different from the villagers who banked embers in clay, or the mothers who curled around their children in the dark. We just have more tools now. But the desire, the need to sleep safely, warmly, beside someone we trust, that's never left. So next time you fluff your pillow, remember, comfort is a recent invention. For most of history, sleep was a test. And the fact that you're still here, warm, breathing, alive, that's a testament to those who came before you and refused to freeze. We wrap ourselves in memory foam and electric blankets, but for most of history, staying warm while you slept meant grit, community, and a whole lot of hay. Medieval peasants didn't have the luxury to complain. They had to innovate or freeze. And somehow, they passed down a legacy of resilience we still carry in our bones. So, what do you think? Could you have survived a single winter night in a medieval hut? Would you spoon a goat just to stay alive? Let us know in the comments. And if you learned something new, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell. We've got more brutal medieval truths coming your way.